So hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual discussion session on U.S. Russia arms control diplomacy. This virtual session has been organized by the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. My name is Chris Rostanpour, and I'm the coalition's policy and communications coordinator, and I'll be moderating this session today. As you are probably already aware, the coalition aims to work to reduce the threats from nuclear weapons by mobilizing advocacy within the physical sciences community since it was founded in 2019. In its initial years, the coalition has mostly focused on raising awareness about the threat of nuclear weapons by offering colloquia at institutions across the country, as well as webinars and encouraging advocacy. Since the start of our partnership with the Arms Control Association in October 22, we have tried to use this opportunity to provide our members with more resources, education, tools, and guidance so that they can advocate for this cause more effectively. Again, as you may have seen just recently, we launched an advocacy campaign to support arms control diplomacy between the United States and Russia. I'm gonna put down a link to that very shortly in the chat. So this session's goal today is to provide more context on this topic and talk about what effective advocacy would look like. This session will have two parts. First, we'll have opening remarks by three of the coalition's experts, and I will introduce them shortly. This part of the session will be recorded. Then we'll go to questions and answers and an open discussion. I can see that we already have some other experts from the coalition who are present on this call. So I'm hoping that it will be a very interesting and fruitful session. So on that note, I'm going to introduce our speakers today to you. So we have Daryl Kimball, who's on the steering committee of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. He's also the executive director of the Arms Control Association, a partner of the coalition since 2022, as I mentioned. So he leads the Arms Control Association's education, research, and policy advocacy campaigns on a range of issues dealing with reducing the threat of nuclear weapons. We also have with us Dr. Tara Drozdenko, who's one of the project team members of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reductions, who, as you know, brings our colloquia to institutions across the country. She's also the director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And at that role, she leads the program on federal level policy changes and a commitment to diplomacy to ensure the United States is a leader in reducing the nuclear threat. We also have Dr. Frank von Hippel with us, who's also on the steering committee of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. He is also one of our project team members who give colloquia. He is a senior research physicist and professor of public and international affairs emeritus with Princeton's program on science and global security, which he co-founded. He has played a leading role in various advocacy campaigns, including efforts to end the nuclear arms race between the U.S. and Russia in the 1980s. So without further ado, first I'll go to you, Daryl. If you could tell us a little bit about the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or the New START Treaty, about its past, present, and what lies ahead, and the value of efforts to build support in Congress in support of this treaty.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks everybody for being here. We are facing a difficult moment in U.S. Russian nuclear arms control. A year after Russia's invasion, we've seen nuclear threats from Vladimir Putin. U.S. and Russia have had difficulty since the war began, returning back to the negotiating table to discuss issues related to risk reduction through their strategic stability dialogue. And now, formally, Russia is backing away from the last remaining treaty that limits the two largest nuclear arsenals, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty of 2010. So the US and Russia had already been having difficulty resuming the on-site inspections under this critical treaty. The inspections were suspended in March of 2020 because of the pandemic, but they've been bickering about the procedures for resuming those inspections through 2021. So part of what we heard from Putin was expected, part of it was new. So suspension means, according to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that Russia will no longer engage in the on-site inspection process. 18 inspections are allowed each year under the treaty by each side on the other's nuclear facilities. Russia is not going to be making the biannual declarations of warhead deployments that are required under the treaty. That gave us information about how many weapons each side has, and that's what the inspections were helping to check and verify. But Russia did say, and this is very important, that it's not withdrawing from the treaty, and that Russia will continue to abide by the central limits of the treaty. So in other words, the central limits of the treaty say that the United States and Russia neither will have any more than 1,550 deployed strategic warheads on no more than 700 strategic delivery vehicles. In other words, the long-range ballistic missiles and strategic bombers. So that's the one bit of good news here. However, the other problem is that New START is due to expire in just under 3 years on February 5, 2026. So this low in the relations between the two countries, this body blow to the New START treaty, makes it far less likely that the two sides are going to be able to negotiate a new agreement to supersede New START in time before New START expires. And that opens the door, theoretically, to each side exceeding the limits of New START and increasing the total number of strategic nuclear weapons, which would put us obviously in the wrong direction. Now, Russia has outlined shifting in vague terms for reversing its decision. It's clearly connected its decision to its frustration about the United States support for Ukraine's defense. What they say officially is that the United States must demonstrate, quote, political will and honest efforts towards general de-escalation and the creation of conditions for resuming the comprehensive operation of the treaty. So that's Diplo speak for we're very frustrated with you and we're holding this treaty hostage in hopes that it will leverage some changes in your approach on the war in Ukraine. The administration, for its part, has said that's not going to happen. We're not going to change our approach, but we do, the door is open to dialogue with Russia on resuming inspections and on strategic arms control in general. And very encouragingly, right after Putin's announcement, Tony Blinken reaffirmed the U.S. readiness to talk about strategic arms limitations with Russia. President Biden last year said that he's ready to expeditiously negotiate a new strategic arms control framework with Russia. So that's the situation diplomatically with New START. I would add that there are a number of other countries that are weighing in, including China, Germany, others, Kazakhstan, urging the two sides to get back to the negotiating table. Congress is split on this issue. Many members of Congress, Democrats entirely, are encouraging the Biden administration to continue to engage with Russia in a dialogue on risk reduction and a new nuclear arms control framework. Republicans, however, are arguing that it's time to step away from New START. This was a bad deal. Russia's cheating, and we need to be prepared to increase the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. So that sets up a debate, which I think Frank will discuss a little bit later about, well, if worse comes to worse, what's the right response on the part of the United States to this situation? Worse comes to worse, meaning New START and is gone, and there's nothing to replace it. So one thing I would just add about the importance of, scientists, members of the public, and other people concerned about the nuclear threat at this moment weighing in is that, we are on the cusp of a debate that is going to go on for the better part of a year or 2 years in the midst of the war in Ukraine, in the midst of other concerns about international security. Should the United States be pursuing diplomacy with our adversaries? Should we be preparing to build up our nuclear arsenal? And it's an important moment, I think, for those of us concerned about which direction we go in to weigh in. And members of Congress, they really do need to hear from constituents about what they feel. That empowers them to speak up and take action. I know from meetings at the White House and the State Department, they are looking for political support for the track that they're on. What exactly the path ahead is difficult to identify given the difficulties. But what I will point out, and this is what the Arms Control Association is focusing on, and I think that there's support for this in the White House at the moment. At the very least, they believe it's possible. I believe it's possible for the United States and Russia to reach some sort of understanding that neither will exceed the limits of New START until such time as a new formal agreement is concluded, even if there is not a resumption of the on-site inspections under New START. That can buy time. That's clearly a lesser form of arms control, but it is important to avoid the arms racing that could ensue if and when New START is gone. So let me stop there. Let me turn it over to Tara and to Frank, and then we'll look forward to your questions and observations, discussion.
Thank you so much for that introduction to the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, Daryl. On that note, Tara, I know that you recently wrote an article in the Union of Concerned Scientists titled "1 Year After Russia Invaded Ukraine, What's Changed for Arms Control?" So I was hoping that you could talk to us a little bit about the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on global arms control, but specifically on U.S. Russia arms control.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Chris. And just wanted to say thanks to everyone for being here. I have very brief remarks, so hopefully, even though they are short, they will still trigger some interesting discussion. And I ask all of your grace and forgiveness. I have been traveling all week for a board meeting, and so if my thoughts are a bit disjointed, I apologize. So let me just start by saying that if you, like me, have been worried this year about the possibility of nuclear weapons use, good. I think that's an appropriate and healthy response to this past year. I don't think we should be panicked, but I do think that if you're not worried, then there's something wrong. So we've been very fortunate this past year that even in the middle of this heightened tension between the U.S. and Russia, we haven't had any incidents of miscalculation or misunderstanding. But we knew from the start of the war in Ukraine that it's going to have some serious implications for international security, for the U.S. Russia relationship. And even though those most immediate fears about Russia and NATO stumbling into war are not something that we have seen come to pass, there's been some other very serious damage, particularly to arms control as a result of the war. And as Daryl mentioned, Russia recently suspended participation in New START, which is the last remaining bilateral treaty between the U.S. and Russia. And that followed a January State Department conclusion that Russia was refusing to permit the U.S. to conduct treaty-mandated inspections, and that Russia would not meet in the bilateral consultative commission. And because of that, Russia was not complying with treaty provisions. So there was a non-compliance finding in January. And the reasons that Russia has given for their non-compliance and for their suspension ultimately is connected to the war in Ukraine. And Russia has claimed that that U.S. sanctions were hindering their ability, and the sanctions are a result of the war in Ukraine, that U.S. sanctions were hindering their ability to conduct their own inspections in the United States. But those are very surmountable issues, and that ultimately was just, result. It was just poor excuses. And Russia's also wanted to discuss Western aid to Ukraine as part of the bilateral consultative commission, and the U.S. Has wanted to confine those discussions strictly to New START implementation. So the two states have found themselves at an impasse, with the war in Ukraine really being at the heart of this impasse. But that's just one consequence of the war in Ukraine and one impact on arms control. There's a much broader implication here that goes beyond the loss of just a single arms control treaty. And Daryl mentioned this as well. The war in Ukraine is being used by some policymakers in the U.S. as an excuse to push for more new and better weapons. And so in the present circumstances, we, I think, can expect lawmakers will be prone to increase military and weapons spending. And then as a result of that, moves in that direction are going to have a detrimental effect on this increasingly competitive relationship we have with China. So the U.S. and China are in a cycle of distrust and military buildup right now. So a U.S. reaction to the war in Ukraine is going to have a consequence for our relationship with China. And so as much as possible, it's important that policymakers are able to prioritize arms control with Russia, even in the midst of an active war in Ukraine. Arms control is not an activity that we carry out only with our friends. And regardless of some of the aggravating factors, we need to continue to try to talk with Russia about constraining our nuclear arsenals and hopefully one day even reducing them further. Now, Russia very candidly does not seem ready to engage in this conversation at the moment, but that does not mean that the U.S. should give up. It needs to continue to pursue this with vigor. And we also can't let the U.S. defense establishment use the war in Ukraine as an excuse to increase our nuclear arsenals in both number and destructiveness. Both the war in Ukraine and concerns about China's nuclear program are motivators for increased U.S. nuclear weapons capacity. And as Daryl mentioned, and I said previously, there are some folks in the nuclear security space that want to run out the clock on New START and therefore lift the legal limits we have on our deployed nuclear warheads. And a lot of that is motivated by the fact that China is not constrained by our bilateral treaty with Russia. But that's a really dangerous approach for international security broadly. And it's also not great for the U.S. because it's going to lead to a very costly new arms race, a lot of resources, and will be sunk into that over the next decade or more, if that's the road we go down. So the possibility that New START's going to expire without anything to take its place, and then this foreign and defense policy towards China that is feeding this escalating competition dynamic. Those are just two specific issues that lie against an even bigger backdrop, which is that our nuclear weapons system is unjust and inequitable, and it's unable to bring true security to everyone, and it's ill-equipped to do that as well. And so in addition to these very specific issues of arms control, we need to be also broadening our frame and thinking about how do we transform our security framework It starts with specific solutions like arms control, but it's ultimately going to require fundamental changes to the way that we make decisions about nuclear weapons. For the most part in this country, there's a very small elite group of policymakers that make these decisions, and they are very devoted to maintaining the status quo. And if we ever want to move away from that status quo to a world that is free of nuclear weapons or has fewer nuclear weapons, we have to resist this regression that's happening right now, and continue to push for a path that will ultimately provide true security for everybody. And that is the conclusion of my remarks. Thanks.
Okay, I guess I'm next. Daryl said I would speak to the what do we do if worse comes to worse. In fact, I wasn't prepared to do that, but I'll try to rise to the occasion briefly before I talk about what I was going to talk about. Part of the problem is that we're transitioning from a two-body problem, a U.S. Russia problem, to a three-body problem, including China, and that's more difficult to deal with. But that does not mean that we need as many strategic warheads as China and Russia combined. Garwin used to say, we need what we need, not what they have, which is, I think, by the way, what we are limited to under New START is 1,550 ballistic missile warheads plus bombers. That's already more than we need. During the Obama administration, the Joint Chiefs of Staff said they thought we could reduce to 1,000 and cover all the essential targets in Russia, China, and North Korea. And some of us might disagree on whether all those targets are essential. So that's just briefly, and I hope we on the larger issue, and I hope we can discuss that further during the discussion. But my prepared remarks relate to how ballistic missile defense complicates nuclear arms control and is driving the nuclear arms race, and that's an issue that I think we all need to understand. And in fact, it was apparent already at the very beginning. The first generation of physicists who tried to educate Congress and the public about the danger from nuclear weapons were the young physicists from the U.S. World War II nuclear weapons project. They had an opportunity to think about these issues before the rest of the world became aware of what had, of nuclear weapons. Their mantra had two parts. There is no secret and there's no defense. That was their mantra. And that there is no defense has been hard for our Department of Defense to accept. The DoD tried first to erect defenses against Soviet nuclear bombers, and then after Sputnik in 1957, defenses against ballistic missiles. But the DoD simultaneously worked on ways to penetrate Soviet bomber defenses and missile defenses. And that turned out to be much easier, a much easier task. And the things that the strategies we developed, were adopted by the Soviet Union as well, and would neutralize U.S. defenses as well. You can fool defense radars with decoys, chaff, and even by generating clouds of ions in the upper atmosphere with nuclear explosions. But the crudest way to deal with defenses is to overwhelm them by multiplying the number of attacking weapons. And that's where the DoD and the Soviet Union ended up spending most of their resources. We invented low-flying nuclear-armed cruise missiles that could be launched by bombers from beyond the range of air defenses. And as a result, each U.S. B-52 could carry up to 20 long-range nuclear-armed cruise missiles internally and under their wings. So the defense against the B-52s becomes irrelevant. For ballistic missile defenses, the U.S. developed compact nuclear warheads and reentry vehicles, and we deployed up to 14 warheads on each of our submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Today, there are fewer because of the limits. I think the average is about 5 today because of the limits, the reductions associated with New START. So, but the point is that defenses just stimulated an offensive buildup. And in the late 1960s, after President Johnson committed to ballistic missile defense, a second generation of activist physicists tried to explain the futility of defenses to Congress. The Army helped them get public attention by deciding to base missile interceptors armed with 5 megaton warheads in the suburbs of the largest U.S. metropolitan areas. The result was a not in my backyard uprising, and Congress started paying attention. The debate actually started in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which was much more assertive in those days than today. And opposition built to the point where President Nixon, who had actually driven in his campaign statements, had driven the Johnson administration to commit to ballistic missile defense, he saw the handwriting on the wall. Senior U.S. physicists prepared the way for negotiations with the Soviet Union by convincing their Soviet counterparts that missile defense was both futile and counterproductive. So in 1972, the Nixon administration made 2 agreements with the Soviet Union. One, the anti-ballistic missile or ABM treaty, which limited each country to 200 and later to 100 interceptors. And the second was an executive agreement which capped the buildup of offensive strategic ballistic missiles. This paved the way for the arms control that happened during the rest of the Cold War and thereafter. In 2002, however, President Bush Jr. took the U.S. out of the ABM treaty. He argued it was no longer necessary. The Cold War had ended. The U.S. and Soviet Union were no longer adversaries. And furthermore, he argued that the U.S. needed ballistic missile defenses against the nuclear-armed ballistic missiles that Bush's Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, predicted that Iran, Iraq, and North Korea would deploy within a few years. In fact, however, Republicans have always been for missile defense, irrespective of whether it works or not. President Bush ordered that the first interceptors be deployed before the end of his first term, and they were exempted from all of DoD's testing and effectiveness requirements. Not surprisingly, the program has been a fiasco. And in fact, the U.S. Has spent in today's dollars about $350 billion since President Johnson, with very little to show for it. Neither the Russians nor the Chinese took, and more recently, the Chinese took this well, the U.S. Ballistic missile defense. Actually, President Johnson, Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, announced that our ballistic missile defenses would be not against the Soviet Union, but against China, this was 10 years before China had ballistic missiles. Both Russia and China have demanded constraints on U.S. ballistic missiles, but the support for ballistic missile defense among congressional Republicans has been strong, and after the end of the Cold War, few Democrats have been interested in the issue. So the advocates have prevailed. Russia, therefore, began deploying new strategic delivery vehicles to underfly U.S. defenses. They include hypersonic glide re-entry vehicles that can travel dozens of kilometers within the upper for interceptions in space. They also include a large nuclear-powered torpedo with intercontinental range and a multi-megaton warhead that could destroy U.S. port cities. And they are developing a nuclear-powered cruise missile that would have unlimited range if it worked. The action has been to build up, but certainly our ballistic missile defenses have been one driver for China's buildup, although the confrontation over Taiwan is probably another. Historically, China had been satisfied with a nuclear arsenal an order of magnitude smaller than ours. They've had in as late as 2021, they had about 260 warheads on intercontinental and ballistic and submarine launched ballistic missiles. In 2021, however, China was discovered to be building underground silos for 300 intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are now nearing completion. If these silos are all filled with China's latest ICBM, the DF-41, which can carry up to 3 warheads each, China will have on the order of 1,000 warheads. That would put it in the same league as the U.S. with regard to ICBMs, although China's ballistic missile submarines would be less numerous and technologically far inferior to ours. Both Russia and China have been insisting all along that U.S. ballistic missile defense be on the table in any future nuclear arms control negotiations. And the Biden administration recently whispered in its missile defense review that it is at least open to discussing this subject, which is under Trump, and before it was unthinkable that we would negotiate, politically unthinkable in terms of our domestic politics, that we would negotiate limits on our ballistic missile defenses. There would be a huge outcry from the Republicans, however. I've raised this because I think we should add to our agenda, the Physicists Coalition agenda, educating Congress, those in Congress who are open to education on ballistic missile defense, on its futility and its counterproductive characteristics. And I hope we can get to that in the not too distant future, and maybe have a webinar which goes into ballistic missile defense in greater depth. So that's what I had to say. Thank you.